everybody. It's great to have all of you here, our members and our guests. My name is Dave Kaiser. I'm the chair of the Chamber, as well as the Senior Vice President of Retail Services for Central One Federal Credit Union. And it's truly an honor to welcome you all here for our annual legislative breakfast. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize and thank our presenting sponsor for today's breakfast. Berkshire Bank has been a generous partner and sponsor of the Chamber's legislative breakfast for the last 14 years. And we have with us today Christopher Acosta, who is the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending. And I'd like to invite Chris up to say a few words.
Thank you, David. It's that time of year again. The Quarter 9, 495 Regional Chamber of MetroWest Legislative Breakfast. I know I enjoy hearing from our state reps and senators every year. Berkshire, once again, is honored to be presenting sponsor for the legislative breakfast. I want to thank Karen Chapman and her staff for their tireless effort coordinating this event every year. And once again, we have the esteemed Mark Donaghue from Fletcher Tilton, who will be moderating. Mark will be moderating this breakfast for as long as I can remember, and nobody does it better, Mark. And actually, on the drive over here, I was thinking about it. Berkshire, I was talking to Karen this morning, Berkshire and our predecessor, Commerce Bank, has been the presenting sponsor, as David said, for 14 years. And the Commerce president, Brian Thompson, was always presenting this for Commerce Bank. And I just want to remember Brian. Brian passed away this past summer. A great man, great banker, really a mentor to many people in the industry, and a true gentleman. So I just want to thank Brian, let him know I'm thinking of him. Again, it's always great to actually, I didn't say this. It's great to see our senators and reps. And, to wake up so early for this event, I'm glad you all got here. I know there was a little traffic, so it's good to see you all. And I think, Michael Moore, you're here, right? I think, I don't think there's been an event you haven't missed, right? You've been here every one, right? Great to see you. A little bit about Berkshire Bank. As many of you may know, Berkshire offers more than 175 years worth of strength and stability. We are currently a $12 billion community bank with a community focus. Recently, we announced our merger of equals with Brookline Bank, which we anticipate to close in the second half of this year. The combined company will have approximately $24 billion in assets and more than 140 branches across 5 states. The partnership is between two like-minded organizations that will continue to benefit our clients, employees, shareholders, and our communities. And speaking of community, in 2024, Berkshire Bank provided over $200,000 in grants throughout central Massachusetts. In addition, we close our bank every year, and every employee volunteers in the community. We truly believe in giving back. And actually, hot off the presses, Newsweek once again named Berkshire Bank as one of the most trustworthy companies in America. We're very proud of that. And finally, joining me here today is Beth Minio, who is currently our Managing Director for Private Banking. However, she will be the Regional President of Central Mass post-merger. We're very excited to have Beth with us today. Additionally, many of you know Christina Andrioli from our private banking group, and Rick Thal, who leads our Central Mass branches, are both here this morning. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to help you. Thank you very much, and enjoy the panel discussion with our legislators.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Berkshire Bank, for being our sponsor for today and a great supporter of the Chamber over the years. Now, before we introduce our distinguished officials from the state, I'd like to take a moment to recognize some of our local officials who have joined us here today. And as I say your name, please stand and rise so that we can recognize you. But I'll ask the audience if you can hold off your applause until after we've mentioned all the names. So let's start with, from the 495 MetroWest Partnership, Executive Director Jason Powell. Jason. From the town of from the town of Southborough, let's start there. The Economic Development Coordinator for the town of Southborough, Leah Emerson. The town of Westborough, from the Select Board, Shelby Marshall. From the Community Development Director, Fred Lenardo. Economic Development Coordinator, Lara Crawford. And members of the Westborough Economic Development Committee, Dave Bagden of the Community Advocate, Sandy Coker of Human Power Solutions, Holly Kenny of LCK Art Studio and Gift Gallery, Karen Henderson of Westborough TV, and our president of the Chamber, Karen Chapman. Last but not least, I'd like to also ask any of the Chamber's board members to please stand so that we can also recognize you for your service. And for all of these folks, and I hope I didn't miss anybody. If I did, please stand up and be recognized. Nobody took that off. All right. It's also my pleasure to recognize and welcome any of our new members, as well as any of our first-time guests who are visiting us here today. So if you are a first-time guest visiting, or if you are a new member, please stand so we can give you a nice warm welcome. And finally, I want to recognize some additional supporters of today's event. First off, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize DoubleTree Hotel and their amazing staff for putting on this great breakfast. I want to also recognize again Karen Henderson, who is here from Westborough TV, videoing us today. And Tony Gallo from Gallo Moving and Storage as our hallway exhibitor this morning. Now it's time to get started with the panel discussion. So I'd like to invite our distinguished legislators to come on up to the stage and take your seats. I know it's a little difficult out there. Everybody's probably been talking about, I guess there was a big accident on 290, so it's challenging for some folks to get here. And as everybody gets situated, I want to take a minute to mention our moderator for today. Talk a little bit about our moderator. It's definitely an honor to introduce this person that we all know as our moderator. Mark Donaghue is the Director of Corporate Business and Real Estate Practice Groups and a member of the firm's Management Committee for Fletcher Tilton PC, Attorneys at Law. He brings a unique skill set to his practice, part real estate attorney as well as corporate attorney. He's essentially a business lawyer, trusted advisor, and sounding board on major decisions and judgment calls for his clients. And over the past 25 years, he's been involved in some of the major real estate development initiatives within Worcester County. Since 1986, he has been an active member of the greater Worcester community, including serving on the board of directors for the YMCA of Central Massachusetts, and he is currently on our board here at Quarter 9, and actually served as our chairman as in the years 2011 to 2012. Mark is a highly skilled moderator, known for his great business insight, his quick wit, and his sense of humor. He often conducts programs for the Worcester Bar Association, Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce, and has been facilitating our legislative breakfast for 20 years. So, Chamber members and guests, please join me in welcoming to the stage our moderator for today's discussion, Mark Donaghue.
Thanks, David, for reminding me how old I am. Really appreciate that. And let me echo the thanks to Berkshire Bank. Chris mentioned Brian Thompson. I actually remember when Duddy Massad sat there and was part of the history of the support that this chamber has had from Berkshire. We greatly appreciate it. So welcome, friends, to the annual Corridor 9 Civics class. This is not a breakfast with a lot of corny icebreakers or ugliest sweater contests or anything of that nature. It's kind of appropriate. We do this generally in the spring, kind of do it, you know, coincides with Lent. It's got that Lenten feel to it. Kind of something you really don't want to do. Maybe it's going to make you a better person, so you can suck it up and you do it. I'm glad to hear it.
It's a great thing.
And, you know, we've been doing this a while, as Dave indicated. And, you know, we've seen legislators come and go, except Mike Moore, he's but more importantly, we've seen issues we've talked about solved, and we've seen issues that are more like sunsets. They go away and they come back under a different name in some fashion. But I have to tell you, the sense I have is that the times they are changing. Maybe it's part of getting old. Beyond a peaked interest in pharmaceutical ads you see on television all of a sudden, you get a certain perspective as to what time means. But it feels like we're at an inflection point. It feels like the entire purpose and goal of government is being questioned. I've always believed, and I still believe, that government has some basic roles. A couple of those basic roles is to help those who can't help themselves and make sure people play fair. Seems like at a lot of points in our life right now, that whole concept is being challenged. As Jon Stewart recently said, ask not what you can do for your country, ask what you can stop the country for doing for someone else. Times are changing. Whether the E in Doge means efficiency or elimination is a real question. And the timing is important. Next month, we'll celebrate together the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. 250 years of this country. That feels like a long time sometimes, but think about it, put it in perspective, you know. Think about who you know personally and how much of that American experience they had. By way of example, my grandmother was born in 1898 in Kilchavo, County Mayo, and came to the United States in 1960 and died here in 1996. So I knew her personally, which means I've known somebody personally for better than half the life of this country. That's crazy. But I think it's important to keep in mind as to how we kind of phrase all of this. So what's the sermon got to do with today? Like, get to the point. Here. What it's got to do with is it's events like this where the rubber hits the road of being a people who want to govern themselves. Because when you govern yourself, you've got to pick people who are going to do your bit. And more importantly, they're going to represent you. They're going to represent what you think is important. They're going to represent you in a fashion that you think is important. And how we find out who those people are going to be and how they find out who and demonstrate to us their abilities are by these kind of events where we ask hard questions, we listen to the answers, and we make a determination as to whether they're the right people for us and weigh in. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel and get the process going. Senator Michael Moore represents the 2nd Worcester District. That includes Auburn, Grafton, Millbury, Shrewsbury, Westboro, and a portion of Worcester. Mike has been with us, I believe, since 2009. Yes, that's great. Senator Robyn Kennedy represents the 1st Worcester District, which represents a significant portion of Worcester. Also the towns of Berlin, Bolton, Boylston, Northborough, and West Boylston. Representative Meghan Kilcoyne represents the 12th Worcester District, which includes portions of Berlin, Boylston, Clinton, Lancaster, parts of Northborough, and Sterling. And Kate Donaghue my favorite state representative of all time.
Great last name.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The 19th was the district, which consists of portions of Framingham, Northborough, all of Southborough, and portions of Westborough. Our format is tried and true. We haven't screwed it up yet. We'll keep trying to do it. I've got some questions that we have shared. Some members have shared questions. We've posed those to the legislators. We're going to give them all a couple of minutes to answer it, try to get a couple of answers, touch on as many topics as we can, save some time to the end for questions, and move on with our day. So without further ado, let's take a look at what we can talk about. Last year, actually, we discussed the referendum question on MCAS testing, which eliminated or resulted in the elimination of graduation requirements. Does the state need to establish empirical and meaningful benchmarks toward graduation requirements in order to achieve academic equity and improve outcomes for all students?
Still haven't figured out what this yet.
It's only been since 2009.
So the quick answer is yes. I think we do. I guess this may also tie into what we see going on nationally with the elimination of higher education. Massachusetts, for all the criticisms of the education system, Massachusetts is number 1 and 2 in science and math. To say a system was not effective or didn't work, I think having those numbers kind of contradict that, especially when you look at, you hear across the country how our education system, the United States, I think internationally we're 40th in the world. But if you look at Massachusetts, internationally, I believe we're within the top 10. So I think we had a system that may not have been perfect, but it was working. And we probably should have maybe provided additional resources for the demographics of students that needed that help. So I think we have to, rather than going back to what we had in the early 90s, where we had students that were graduating that couldn't read and write, where we had school districts that were not getting the same level of support from the state. We need some way of making sure every student gets the same access to educational resources across the board. And to do that, we need a system. We need a way of evaluating the education systems in each municipality. So I think it's important that we do find some way of establishing measurement so that we don't put certain communities on and put above other communities.
Thank you, and as often is the case, I respectfully disagree with my good friend and colleague here, and I was a proponent of the ballot question. I think you hit the nail on the head that it maybe worked, but it didn't work for all students, and we know for decades it didn't work and was prohibitive. It's a high-stakes test that is outdated in nature and left many students behind, hundreds per year. And so we do need to improve. We do need to have an understanding. There's legislation pending right now filed by Senator Jason Lewis, who's the chair of the Education Committee, that would require, rather than what is existing now, recommending mass core curriculum for every high school student. The important piece of that is that starts the way to measure across the board by ensuring that every student in our high schools across the Commonwealth are receiving the same curriculum, receiving the same programming. And so that's the first piece. And then we do need to look, and there are a plethora of other existing testing available that helps us understand place to place, school to school, how students are achieving. And so without high stakes measurements and testing, and if you ever walk into a school the week before MCAS, or you know an educator, you can appreciate how challenging the MCAS had become for both educators and how stress-inducing it is for students. And so there are other tools available in terms of being able to consistently measure how our students are achieving. But I also think we also have to talk about, in correlation with that, it was often said that we need to make sure that students in, say, Chelsea are achieving the same way as students as they are in Wellesley. My argument is we need to make sure that schools in Chelsea are funded the same way schools in Wellesley are funded. That's the first challenge we have to tackle, and we know, and I imagine it might be a different question, but there's a whole lot of work we need to do because we know that the Chapter 70 formula is itself now behind in being able to ensure equity and parity in school funding. So I certainly appreciate, we want to understand and ensure that every student is ready to graduate, but we know that there's other stronger mechanisms to be able to do that.
Thank you. My two Senate colleagues have given a good description of both sides of the background. I did actually research this after we got the questions yesterday afternoon, but the department's regulatory proposed changes were presented last month at a board meeting, and what's been suggested by the Department of Education to make it a part of regulation, and it would begin in 2026, that students would be required to complete 2 years of high school English language Algebra 1, geometry, or integrated math 1 and 2. And then there's a science requirement. I know as a person who's spent most of my career as a software engineer, I know how important the sciences are. But it would require 1 year of biology, physics, chemistry, or technology engineering, and they'd need to demonstrate mastery. So that gives a general sense of what's been proposed. Governor Healy established a K through 12 statewide graduation council, which has a broad makeup covering a lot of areas, and their work has begun and is continuing.
I'll just add briefly, I think my colleagues have really covered the breadth of this debate, and Rep. Donaghue kind of gave some insight as to where we're going next. I know, during the ballot question, I never took a public stance on the ballot question myself, but I'll just add the personal element that, I saw having a sister that is currently a public school educator in Chandler Elementary School in Worcester, and my mother, who worked in elementary schools in Holden for many years. Both were in favor of eliminating the MCAS graduation requirement. My sister came from a place of being an educator, working in a school where there's a lot of, I think, need there, a lot of language learners who aren't really starting from the same place as some other students would be in say, the schools we grew up in. And my mom did come from a similar place as well, but she also came from the question as a mother. Growing up, my sister, who is now a teacher, also was on an IEP growing up. And when I was about, I forget what year they started the MCAS, but I was in school when we had to start taking it in 4th grade, had to take it in 8th grade, and it was a graduation requirement. My brother and I never had to worry about it. We were able to just take the test, and we were very fortunate and blessed that it just was a thing we did. It was kind of stressful, but we never were worried about failing the MCAS. We always scored very well. My sister, though, due to her learning disability, struggled to barely pass. And I hope she doesn't mind me sharing that. But it wasn't due to the fact that she wasn't as talented as my brother and I. She clearly has excelled in her career. She went on to graduate from Wachusett Regional despite the MCAS, but because of her IEP, test taking was very difficult. And the pressure that test put on her nearly did create a lot of anxiety and stress, and wasn't always an indicator of what her abilities were as a student, and clearly wasn't an indicator of what her abilities were and her talents were. So my hope is that when we look forward, I think, like my colleagues have said, we certainly want to make sure we're measuring learning loss, we certainly want to make sure we're measuring certain benchmarks and that students are graduating, our education system is living up to its promise of creating opportunity, of creating equal opportunity for everybody. But I do hope that with that ballot question passed, we are creating a space for students that are under IEPs, maybe are English language learners, schools that don't have the same resources as every others will hopefully create a better learning environment. So we certainly will be looking and working with the administration closely as we go forward with this, but that was sort of my insight of this whole thing, and trying to approach this policy with, you know, our own lived experience, but also the experiences of our constituents and each and every one of you. Any of you that have students or have been through the school system and MCAS yourself understand what this test can do, what it can mean. Sure, it does have possible benefits, but my hope going forward is we can create a better learning environment for everybody, and students and educators alike.
Perhaps in the nature of follow-up, I could ask that while an MCAS was really focused on whether a student failed, and without that, you don't have that measurement, how does one determine whether a system is failing a student?
That's a very good question. And I think one that, I know, well, I mean, what, I shouldn't have, I don't know why I sounded surprised by it. By the way, my family's from County Mayo too. A few more generations back though. So that is, I think, a really interesting question, just given what we were seeing at the federal level. If the Department of Education is eliminated, the state of Massachusetts is going to be far more responsible for ensuring that all of our schools are having equal outcomes for all of our students. I think that I think that Senator Kennedy maybe has referenced this earlier in her remarks, but there are different ways you can look at successes, look at graduation rates. There's a lot of emphasis now, and I know, I don't want to get too off topic, but looking at, how students are faring after graduation. Some students may be going on to higher education, others may be going into the workforce, and certainly vocational schools are a big part of that, making sure students have the opportunity to go into trades. But I think that in terms of, other than MCAS, like in terms of looking at how teachers are doing, how students are doing, how principals are doing, I think there's other ways and ways that we currently are using to measure schools that don't necessarily are reflective of test scores. And I don't want to speak too much to the specifics because part of that is the job of the Department of Education, of DESE. We just actually, along with Senator Kennedy, we had Ways and Means hearing in Amherst that talked to Secretary Tutwiler and other members of DESE and the education fields on sort of what they're seeing the needs are for schools. That was more related to funding. But that's another way that we look closely at. We want to make sure that when we're allocating funding at the state level for each of these schools, that they are meeting the needs and standards required in terms of offering each of our students a quality education.
When the MCAS first got passed, one of the schools in my district in Worcester, Union Hill School, I think it was a level 2 or level 4 school. So when you look at the levels, level 1, 2, 3, 4, when it gets to be a 3, you get some state oversight. You get to 4, the state can come in, and they can come in and revisit the entire curriculum, and they can suspend contracts. So the reason I'm saying is that the MCAS, not only there was a measurement for the students, but it's also a measurement of way of evaluating the teachers and how their success in teaching. But when the state came in and they basically blew up the contract, they gave the city additional resources. This school, over the years now, with the reforms that have been made, has, I think it's a level 2 school now. So the changes that were made and the authority that they were given to come in and make the changes necessary, I think that's an important side of this also. I think every one of us agree that everyone deserves the same access and the same resources, but we have to have a measurement for that. My 2 children had to experience the MCAS entire life through their school system. So I know the pressure and the stresses that they were under. And when you go to the schools, it was basically a lockdown where the students were in there. But I also remember a time when I was going to school where you didn't need the MCAS. If you passed, you basically had to pass all your classes and you were held back. But that system didn't work, that standard didn't work. We needed some state intervention to make sure certain standards were upheld and that every school system, and we have to say that every school system gets the same amount of resources. Now we have, for all the criticisms of the Chapter 70 formula we have right now, urban school districts will get more state resources than the suburban school districts. And now, the argument that we're revisiting Chapter 70, I've had, all my suburban school districts are all complaining now that they are not getting access to the same level of resources from the state. So the system does need to be addressed. But I think we have to look at the success of the students, also the success, as going back to the question about the system. School systems that the state has had to come in and make reforms. Have those reforms been successful in how the students have performed?
So, and I think, from the technical perspective, I agree with my colleagues in their answers. I'd go back and add, maybe a little bit more philosophical perspective, and certainly, Mark, to your point about the inflection point where we are as a nation right now. And, it's the notion of we have to continue to look at our systems differently and reconsider how we're evaluating. In so many ways, and MCAS was a perfect example of this. We're setting up, we want to talk about measuring standards, but we're setting up our educators, our school systems to fail, right? Because we are not investing. Worcester had a $20 million deficiency this year because of inefficiencies and glitches in the way the formula was allocated. The inflation factor was a huge challenge for the city of Worcester, and I imagine many other communities across the Commonwealth. That's cuts to educators, right? That's cuts to positions. We know our regional school districts are facing significant cuts. School transportation is far outpacing projections for schools and facing major deficiencies because we haven't kept pace with adequately funding school transportation. So, I challenge us, we got to invest. If we value our education system here in the Commonwealth, if we want to set high standards, if we want to continue to be number one in the nation, then we have to actually pay for that investment. We actually have to be able to continue that progress. And we have a lot of work to do because, as was noted, and certainly we heard at the hearing at the beginning of the week, every school district, rural school districts, minimum age school districts, everything is been coming up short in the last several years. And so we have to be talking, and not to mention the scary word of Proposition 2.5, which we know almost every community is having to grapple with. That's not the type of system we should be evaluating. We are number one in the nation because we are the education state, because we valued it. And so yes, absolutely, we have to continue to have high standards. We have to be able to continue to find ways to measure. But I would challenge us as the government, as community leaders, that we actually have to pay to be able to meet those standards. And so far and over the last several years, we have not invested efficiently or adequately to be able to meet the high standards that we want to continue to get to. So, I think we need to continue to do that, to invest. And again, often when those cuts happen, it's a lot of the supportive services to make sure that students in the schools can actually keep the supports that they need. It's some of the arts program, which we know for so many of our students, that's the way they learn best, and to be able to lose those types of positions is challenging in the overall education that a student receives. The other piece, and I know we're going to touch upon it later in the vocational technical programming, but I'd also challenge you as we kind of at that inflection point is we also have to think differently about career pathways for our young people. I think for the past 40 years, there's been a push, and sorry for anyone in higher ed here because I'm going to challenge this push of you graduate high school and you automatically have to go into college. And what we've done is created a significant amount of debilitating debt in this country because of that notion. Vocational programming is an incredible pathway into the workforce, into positions that we need in our community, and allows young people to be able to go into the workforce and then build their way up and not have to start out their career with crippling debt, inability to buy a home, afford a home, be able to start a family, pay for basic needs. And so we also have to be thinking, and I imagine as I look at some of the companies that I see represented around here, I know there's some precision manufacturing positions or companies that are hiring at, and this is old data, but at the time, $85,000 is starting positions that require a high school diploma. How are we helping young people think about getting into those workforces that we need? And again, then going back to school, building their way up, getting advanced degrees that can help them increase their income. And so I know we're going to be talking about workforce later, we're going to be talking about vocational education. We have to be thinking differently about how we continue the narrative of pathways for young people as they continue to grow. So a little bit off the question, but hopefully touching on some other pieces.
And Mark, I just quickly want to add, because I haven't finished my copy totally, so I'm not firing on all cylinders at the moment. I just want to add that teachers already have very high standards that they have to meet before they can even start teaching. They need to get their master's degree in Massachusetts to be a public educator. They have to pass the MTELs. They're another set of standardized tests. And many of those MTELs are continuous the more that they want to move on or teach other subjects. There's different MTELs depending if you're elementary, secondary, high school, etc. So teachers already are under very high standards. And kind of to jump up what Senator Kennedy said, we're hearing from a lot of our own, I represent a lot of regional schools in my district. Many of them are facing very serious budget challenges, and many of the responses that they may be forced to take are to cut staff. And if you cut staff and you cut teachers, you're either going to force your existing teachers to have larger classroom sizes, which can make it more difficult to teach, or you're going to not be able to offer as many class options for your students to take. And one of the things that I know, having been a graduate of a regional school in the area in Wachusett, is it's really scary to me that I graduated in 2006 from Wachusett, and if we don't do something about trying to support our regional schools, the students that are graduating now, the students that are graduating tomorrow, the students that my peers are now having that may go through that school system one time, we have fewer class options and opportunities than I did, and we just cannot let that happen. So when we're talking about measuring success overall for schools, that's kind of how I look at it holistically. So I just wanted to add that because I was really mad I forgot to say it first. Sorry, Kate.
Thank you. Let's move on to a new topic. Let's see if we can talk on something else that Massachusetts is known particularly for, and that's healthcare. Last year, we saw the collapse of Stewart Healthcare and the impacts on the Commonwealth from closing of 4 different hospitals. Recent data indicates that in Massachusetts, better than 2/3 of all hospitals are operationally losing money. There are a number of reasons that administrators blame on that, being a cost of lack of workforce, administrative burdens from insurers, and the like. But one of the litanies is the systemic adjustment in the manner in which the state reimburses hospitals for taking care of mass healthcare patients. What initiatives do you see coming up to try to stabilize this most critical component of our healthcare system?
I think this is going to be one of the, continuing to be one of the more difficult problems that we have to address this year. I think first thing we need to have better transparency in pricing. So that when you're looking at any sort of healthcare choices, going into that facility or physician or doctor, you're going to see that what the costs are going to be. To give patients more choice. But as far as supporting the system, and I don't want to deflect this on nationally, but they just passed a continuing resolution that $880 billion that is going to be cut over the next 10 years. And we've heard some numbers that could translate to from $1 to $2 billion here in Massachusetts. So we've already got a system that is under severe stress. This is going to be a very hard question for us to get anyone of us to answer. We don't know how that's going to play out over the next 6 months as we do a budget, and how we're going to be able to look at what resources are available. $62 billion state budget and roughly $42 billion $42 billion is from state revenue. At $20 billion, I think 60–70% of that is related to healthcare. So we have a lot of choices. We're going to be faced with a lot of difficult choices. And I don't think any one of us I could be wrong, I don't think any one of us up here right now are going to be able to tell you how that's going to play out and how we're going to be able to address that. If we were facing a recession over the next fiscal year, you have a good idea of how to address that recession. Stimulate business, provide incentives, try to help the workforce, the business community, But when you're in a system where every morning you wake up, and I think as Mark said, that elimination, you're facing some person's whim of just cutting funding. How do you budget for that? That's a problem that we are going to be facing over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, 4 years. So, sorry I didn't answer, but I think we are in a very tough situation right now in Massachusetts. We've got cuts to the NIH that one of the largest employers in Massachusetts and in central Mass could be facing thousands of layoffs.
Yes, 100%, and I just want to underscore the enormity. I keep getting asked in places, what happens if they cut Medicaid? And my answer, quite starkly, is game over, right? There is not a capacity. Just to give a sense of those numbers, the increase FY25 to FY26 because of Medicaid expansion is $2.5 billion here in Massachusetts, 72% of which is federally reimbursed. That's just the expansion from 25 to 26. Our rainy day fund at its entirety is at $8.2 billion. And by the way, having it so high is how we have such a high bond rating in Massachusetts, and we're able to do things like build schools, build public buildings, roads, bridges. And so touching the rainy day is going to also impact our ability to be able to continue that construction and that trajectory we're on. And so part of the balance, but at $8.2 billion, we have, as a rainy day fund, we have very limited capacity. And so it is incredibly stark what we're up against in the federal government and what we're seeing. That said, I do think that there are efforts, and unfortunately it's one of those many issues that we face, that there is no silver bullet. And so this is probably a civics course in of itself of how we get to address this truly. But I think that there's a few big things. One, as Senator Moore mentioned, and we passed legislation last year that helping to get private equity out of our hospitals, right, out of the systems like Steward, like what we saw with Steward in the collapse and what we're seeing with other private equity-owned hospitals and the challenges we're facing because of that. The transparency is a piece of it. And really the cost containment, really setting standards across the Commonwealth. There is no reason that it exists today that the cost of a surgery at MGH is different at the cost of a surgery at St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester. We need to be able to set those cost containment standards so that patients can understand what they're paying for and not get hit with these astronomical bills that we often hear so much about. But we also have to look, there's a plethora of legislation that gets at little pieces around why anesthesiologists have to have a physician in the room with them if they're trained as anesthesiologists to be able to perform their duties. But there's a second payment that goes in because you're paying the physician who's providing oversight to them. So there's all these also little pieces that just balloon costs in our healthcare system. 100% the workforce, 100% the workforce, and that's not a very simple, broad statement to make, or it is a very simple, broad statement to make, but it's 100% true. It can't go without saying, and across industries, across the business world right now, our legacy is a nation of immigrants. We are 100% reliant on immigrants that continue to come here, that continue to build up our workforce. It is not hyperbole to say that if the efforts towards deportation, the efforts even to creating a chilling effect where people aren't going to work because of fear of deportation, our economy, including our healthcare system, is going to crash. That's a reality. These, long-term care facilities, our hospitals, they are sustained by immigrant workforce. So that's a huge piece that we are really up against at the federal government, but that we have to grapple with, because if we're in trouble now, that is going to be expedited tenfold if we continue down this pathway. And so, not to mention, other strategies. There's incentives right now if you're in medical school and tuition incentives if you're in medical school right now to become a PCP. We need to expand those incentives to go into gynecology. That's a big underrepresented workforce right now. Partially because the reimbursement for certain procedures is less, so there's less of incentive to go into certain medical fields. So again, that's another way in which we have to be thinking differently about how we're incentivizing people to go into different medical professions. So I could probably wander on, but I'm gonna stop there and allow space for my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Donaghue, just briefly.
I just wanted to mention that yesterday I had the opportunity to hear a briefing from the Mass Medical Society on some of their target pieces of legislation. One of the things that struck me in terms of the inefficiencies of the system was the problem with pre-authorizations, especially pre-authorizations where people are denied medical care that was deemed to be necessary by their physician, but they are denied necessary medical care by AI. AI looks at the stuff and says, no, this person doesn't need it. And that, I heard stories yesterday of people whose needed medical treatment was delayed by up to 6 months because of this system that's put in place. It's great to have AI approve things, but when AI is denying treatment, taking aside from the issue of AI, the physicians were explaining just how much of their time, how much of their staff time goes into managing pre-authorizations, let alone the time at the insurance companies. So if you look at some of these things, and ultimately, when these pre-authorizations deny people needed coverage, people end up in the emergency room, which is the absolutely most expensive place for us to provide care.
I'll be quick, I promise. I'll just, not to belabor the point, I think my colleagues highlighted all of the challenges ahead. I think I would just add that, we're in the process of writing the budget now. I think the Ways and Means Committee will hear from the Secretary of Health and Human Services in a couple weeks. We are facing very serious headwinds at the federal level, but I think we all want to try to be as realistic as possible, but not to panic. The same challenges exist today that did yesterday, even though they're more compounded. So I think all of us are committed to continuing to try to face this head on. I was very grateful to be appointed by the Speaker as Vice Chair of the Healthcare Financing Committee. So these are questions that I know I'll be dealing with the entirety of the session, and I'm excited to work with my colleagues on that as well. And at a statewide level, and then locally, I know all of us have always been focused. I've always been focused on making sure we're protecting the resources here, that we're protecting the services right here in Central Mass. We're lucky we have UMass. The UMass system is pretty much the major system in Central Massachusetts. Clinton Hospital is in my district, and we're very lucky to have an emergency department in that community, and we want to make sure it stays in that community. But we need to make sure all these services stay in that we have regional equity when we look at it at the state level. So I look forward to continuing to work on protecting and strengthening our Central Mass services here, as well as working with my colleagues to address the very serious concerns that we have before us this session.
Senator Moore, under a minute.
So quickly, Representative Donaghue talked about the AI. We actually just filed a piece of legislation. I chaired the Committee on Artificial Intelligence and Cybersecurity. We just filed a piece of legislation that we got from California that requires when any AI is used in medical decisions, that it has to have a human oversight to get away with the AI platform making the healthcare decision. The other thing is trying to control costs in the healthcare system. We have another piece of legislation that we filed that we've seen the salary discrepancies from the lowest paid employee at a hospital to the highest paid go to 100% differential. So we've got legislation that would minimize that to 50. They cannot exceed 50%. If they do, that medical facility has to contribute money to a managed care fund to help provide services, so that we're not seeing salaries, just administrative salaries, continuing to increase. At some point, you got to say, well, when's enough?
Staying with the theme of questions with no easy answers, let's talk about housing. The governor's indicated a need for 222,000 new housing units in Massachusetts in the next 10 years. And the recent commission has gone so far as to propose the elimination of only single-family housing, allowing by right 2-family and up to 4 units as of right in any lot where both municipal water and sewer are available. Does the need for housing require this type of drastic step, or how are we going to respond to this in the Commonwealth?
So we've already partially responded to it. This last session, the House and Senate passed the Affordable Homes Act, which was a major piece of legislation and sought to put almost $6 billion in investments in housing stock across the board, across income levels. We were able to, this includes everything from public housing all the way up to creating incentives and policies to invest in sort of the middle housing stock across the echelons. So a big part of that session is we really need to focus on making sure those provisions are implemented. Many of you probably heard of the ADU provision that's kind of being rolled out right now. That's something I know I'm hearing a lot from my towns on, but the hope there is to try, we have to kind of think, we were seeking out ways in which we could quickly bring a lot of housing stock on the market quickly. But this is also going to be a long-term conversation. So some of these investments that we're seeing, you know, we really need to make sure that the money is going towards building these housing, but also working with communities and making sure that we are able to kind of work with these localities to make sure that they're open to supporting new developments where they can. And every community is different, so there's always going to be unique challenges, but I think a big part of this session is going to be making sure that we're continuing to see the policies that were in that bill implemented, of which there were a lot, but also making sure we're continuing to have conversations about other creative policies that we might need to consider in the House and Senate. I'm no longer on the Housing Committee, but I did serve as Vice Chair last session, so I was really grateful to learn more about some of these policies, to learn more about the conversations happening in the Commonwealth. But I think all of us, no matter what committees we're on, we're all going to continue to talk about it. But yeah, keep your eye towards the housing bond bill, how that's going to be implemented, where some of these capital investment opportunities are going to come from. And I'll give the rest to my colleagues.
Thank you. I've been reading the Commission's report. There's a lot in there to unpack. Towards Mark's question of two-family houses by right and four-family, whatever the word is, four-family homes, if there's enough infrastructure. I think it's highly unlikely that the legislature would pass those particular provisions. What other alternatives there are is, I think the biggest thing that we really need is incentives to produce modest housing. You know, I talked about this here before. As a relatively recent widow, I look at the options of leaving the home that my husband and I bought in 1977. And there are very, very few options that don't lock you into, you know, high condo rates. I don't want to be worrying about snow plowing and mowing my lawn. But there just aren't a lot of options. Right now, I'm limited to 13 specific precincts, which is, you know, puts that aspect into it. I think that modest housing, particularly at the condo level, is really important. If you're looking at some of the, you know, the climate goals, single-family homes are one of the huge consumers of what, you know, our resources. And one of the single biggest ways to address that is, I don't want to call it congregate housing, but not having single-family homes. So there are a number of things that can be done in this. Public housing is one of the things where I think the state needs to invest. Our public housing is, like it or not, a necessary part of what Mark referred to at the beginning, helping us care for those who are not necessarily able to care for themselves. And we do need to invest in our public housing stock and more mixed housing, so that we have people over incomes, over disparate income levels, all in the same communities. When we develop a community, we need to make sure that people who can pour you coffee or, you know, tend bar can afford to live in the communities. I like this guy, he's always nodding at the things we're saying.
He'll start shaking his head.
And with that, I'll pass it to Sarah.
Well, thank Yeah, and I think that the short answer is yes, right? We're in a housing crisis, there's no question. We say that everywhere, every room, everyone talks about it. It's not just a phrase, it's a reality, and all measures have to be on the table to be able to really tackle that challenge, that crisis that we're in. We have to produce more affordable housing. It is very difficult to do so in building more single-family homes. That's a reality. I looked at all my bankers out here, mortgage providers. It is it's a almost impossible reality to get to building enough affordable housing to be able to do so with more production of single-family homes. So we have to be looking, and again, additional strategies that have been proposed. MBTA Communities Act being a big piece of that. All measures have to be on the table. We also have to look at, and I know it's another question, so I'm going to try not to get too much into it, but how we're supporting families as we get to those 200,000 new units that we have to build. Again, we are in a crisis moment right now. We have to be looking at our systems differently. Going back to your inflection point, Mark, looking at how every community, and that's part of what the MBTA Communities Act is about. Rep. Donaghue talked about it. It's something that I experienced when I was out visiting residents while I was campaigning for office. In many of our communities, there is not enough sufficient multifamily homes for our baby boomer generation to be able to downsize. And so part of what that's doing is creating a backlog so that new and growing families can't then move into their own first homes or expand their homes. And so we have to be able to create this system where people throughout their lifetime are able to move about in other communities. You may be a parent living in Worcester right now, but you want to go into a school system in one of the towns. There needs to be adequate, affordable, accessible housing in each of those spaces. And so, again, in addition to the specific strategies, I say that we have to have, every tool has to be able to be put on the table. We have to work closely with municipalities, and I see our select board members that are here today. There has to be a balance of what we can do and how we can do there, while also pushing the envelope. NIMBYism is a big piece of why we're in the crisis we're in now. So we have to be able to push our way past that, which I know is far more difficult than saying it, but we also have to be able to put the right tools in place. We have to be looking at things outside of the vacuum of housing alone. We have to be looking at things like water and sewer. We have to be looking at public safety capacity. Rep. Kilcoyne and I represent a town. We're building the first 5-story housing building. They don't have a ladder on their fire truck that reaches to the top of that. Right now there's mutual aid and there's shared resources, but we have to be thinking about that. We have to think about how our schools, if we're going to be building more multifamily homes, how we're going to be able to make sure that our schools are adequately supported to welcome in an influx of students. So again, no silver bullet to this, but that's why we have to be able to put every tool and be thinking holistically around this.
So one aspect of the laws that we just changed, dealing with ADUs, making it a by right. Now that, when the law was passed, they are not going to be considered factored into the 10% of the affordable homes for the communities. Can you hear me back there? So that's, ADUs will not be factored in. Now that could be a benefit because it's going to encourage communities to continue to develop affordable housing, or some communities think it's a negative because they want it to happen. I think a big problem that we deal with is, this is really where government and the communities have to have partnerships. I've got one community that passed the MBTA Act at town meeting. The voters tried to repeal it. They didn't. I've got another community that did at town meeting rejected the MBTA Community Act. I've got another community that was just at a meeting the other night that's adamantly opposed to 40B, and they want all these changes to 40B. So at the same time, on the state level, we are trying to address and find options to increase the opportunities for affordable homes. And Senator Kennedy just addressed it with the NIMBYism, and some of them complain about, well, you're changing the character of my community. I moved out of a more urban type community for a more suburban or rural type community, and I don't want these added factors. But this is where we can't have it both ways. You know, government, we can only do so much. We're not an authoritarian government. We can't just come in, we're gonna put housing here, put housing there. We need a partnership. But at the same time that everyone's telling us that we need to create the housing, they are rejecting it on the local level.
Let's talk about an issue that's got a little bit of a bright line to it and affects everybody in this room who's an employer. Governor announced a settlement with the Biden administration as to the COVID overpayment of unemployment by the Commonwealth to the tune of $2.1 billion. And while the general fund is paying the interest on that settlement of $705 million, the $2.1 billion is going to be borne by employers over a 10-year period. And that's on top of the COVID assessment that's already being borne under the unemployment insurance fund, which is also facing insolvency issues. Should all taxpayers bear some accountability for repaying this $2.1 billion, or is it fair that it only be the employers? Not so easy.
Did you say this was right way? Okay, nope, I shut my mic off. I'll take a stab at this one. I know this is a complicated issue, and I know that I don't think anybody wants to see a lot of pressure put on small and local businesses and major businesses when it comes to things like this. That said, we already have kind of highlighted for you the challenges that we're facing at the state level in terms of the budget. The budget's always, though, an evolving thing. It's every year we go back and we look at it and we try to adjust and react to what the situations are as best as possible. Sometimes it's revenues, sometimes it's not. Last year we had a pretty tough revenue situation where we were worried we were going to be in the red. The last few months, though, we've actually been had much healthier revenue streams, which has been good. But now we're faced with drastic federal cuts to the tune of possibly, I think we get around $15 to $20 billion from the federal government, all of which could be eliminated, which is a real possibility that we're going to have to contend with. So I think all that is to say is we, at this time, I have not heard in terms of our hearing process from the business community in terms of how they want the general fund to be spent. There is a public hearing on April 8th, so if employers want to weigh in on that, you're welcome to. But I think we also are very careful on how we're allocating the general fund and making sure that we're already going to be facing very serious conversations and possibly talking about cuts to various programs across the board that's going to have a real life impact on many taxpayers in the Commonwealth. So while we certainly want to make sure we're doing what we can to help our economy and our business community, we're going to keep trying to look at this and making sure that we're using our resources to where it's most needed. So all that is to say, I don't know if that change is going to come in terms of where the general fund will be spent versus interest and versus taking on more of that role. But this is always going to be an evolving conversation as the years go on, so that may change. But I would encourage all the business leaders here, I know we represent various communities in this system, to make sure that you're talking to us if you're seeing, the impact that this is going to have on your local businesses and making sure that you're communicating with us on this issue. I'll tell you right now, nobody's reached out to my office in particular about their concerns on this burden 10 years down the line. So our doors are open. Maybe I'll regret saying that so loudly, but no, we need to hear from you to understand whether or not this is going to be an expense that we need to make. Because if we are hearing from our business communities that this is going to cause doors to shutter, that this is going to cause our economy to dip, maybe that warrants consideration. But we are going to be faced with incredibly difficult conversations. You've already heard the healthcare conversation, and that's just one of many that could be drastically affected by the current economic situation. So we'll see what happens. We're still not done with the hearing process, but I think that's at least I'll turn it over to my colleagues on this now.
Can I jump in on that? So just to give a point of reference, and welcome to the world of a legislator. I have to say, how do we raise revenue, right? And the governor's budget, or House One budget, proposes $300 million in new tax revenue. I think we've all heard, some has been covered in the press, like the candy tax, right? There's also things like taxes on charitable deductions, which we know at a time when we're facing federal cuts, how that's going to impact nonprofits and those that need those resources, and how that could be reduced. Tax on prescription drugs, those are all part of what she has proposed as revenue-raising measures. She's also spent that $300 million in her budget that also includes significant cuts to services like Department of Mental Health caseworkers, et cetera. So we have to talk revenue. One item I would propose, and I'm hoping there's been some traction towards this, is around the GILTI tax, taxing major corporations that are keeping their funds offshore. Most states tax that at 50%, most states. Massachusetts taxes that at 5%. If we were to increase that, taxing major corporations, again, who are keeping their revenues offshore in offshore accounts, we could look at, I've heard everything from $300 to $600 million in potential revenue to that. So, like the Fair Share Amendment, we have to be thinking about who are we impacting with these tax initiatives, and where can we think differently and strategically about how to do that. I agree. And I can imagine without, and I appreciate Rep. Kilcoyne's invitation, but I imagine everyone right now is drafting your email, right? Because regardless, a new will be some type of hit to your income and your bottom line. So that goes without saying. We also have to think about different measures because, unfortunately, because of the previous administration, and we'll call it an error, and say, I don't think it was intentional. It was a very substantial error that we're now trying to grapple with, but we have to. Right? We have to solve for it. And so the question is, do we or don't we? Like most funding decisions, we have to solve for it. So we have to figure out where that is going to come from.
Let me share what my mother taught me to do. So I'm going to stop this point and invite the audience to ask any questions that they may have. Let me remind you, the question has no more than 2 sentences. Question mark at the end of it, so we can try to hit any particular topics that people are interested in.
Also, oops, it's got working too. Okay, big warning. I love a microphone. Don't try to grab my microphone. And it ain't working, so you got 1 minute to ask your question.
Okay, so thank you for covering education first. This is really appreciate not hearing about casinos and cannabis, but education is your first conversation. But my question today is, where are the Republicans? I'm sure there's a story behind that. Thank you.
There's a story behind everything. It's not intentional. It might be my preference, but it's not intentional. No, Representative Kane had previous travel plans, and Representative Meridian called me this morning and unfortunately fell ill. So hopefully they'll be able to join us next year.
Thank you.
I know you mentioned it earlier about vocational schools. I'm on the advisory board with the Worcester Tech High School. The biggest problem they have there is that they have a lot more applicants that the schools could take. So are we looking to expand vocational schools somewhere in Massachusetts?
So this is a big, and again, I want to go back to that inflection point and how we're looking. Worcester Vocational Tech has a 95% college matriculation rate. So that sounds amazing, right? That's a great standard. However, most of the fields that are within the vocational programming don't require a college degree to go into. We have to be talking about how do we get the right students into the right seats. Now, I appreciate a 7th grader does not know necessarily what they want to be with the rest of their lives. But there are definitely indicators, and we have tools that help identify what trajectory kids are going to be on. We know in 7th grade in elementary school whether a kid needs some type of different learning environment. That being in an environment where they're introduced to hard skills, not based on their family's income status, not based on their race or ethnicity, but based on their learning ability and achievement, what type of different setting might be more successful for them. And so we have to be thinking differently about that. I represent, and with my colleagues here, not only Worcester Vogue, but also Assabet, the 2 schools that currently use some type of model of a lottery. I'm quite frankly opposed to a blind lottery because I think we can do better than that. We can help identify rather than a risk, because we know, heck, if I had the chance now, I would want to go to a Vogue school, because why would you not want to go to a state-of-the-art facility, state-of-the-art school, education, and graduate with a hard skill that, when push comes to shove, and we see a lot of students do go back into those fields while they have some crippling debt to do. The one thing I would add is we have to think, again, be expansive in how we make more seats available. I give a huge credit, huge shout out to Worcester Public Schools with each new comprehensive school they've built. They built in at a minimum, which is the most you can do, Chapter 74, four different Chapter 74 type programs. So South High has the large diesel mechanic, early education and care. The new Dougherty High School that just built has finance and literacy management, and then there's a new one called, I don't know the technical term, but it's dirty construction, which is building the pits so when construction starts, which is now the only program in the whole state for doing this type of learning this skill. So as we're building new high schools, as we're expanding, I know some of our regional high schools actually have carpentry shops or welding shops, but are not actually getting Chapter 74 funding to do actual programming there. We need to be able to invest in that as well, because we have to think differently about how we're helping young people get into their right seat. We have to think differently. We're not building as many high schools as we can, so we can't be building as many more vocational programs as we should. We need to think about how we expand access to different types of hard skill, career technical programming.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think all of us are concerned with the lack of the supply not meeting the demand. I represent Boylston along with Senator Kennedy and Clinton, and Aspet Valley Vocational, which is a great school. When they to try to meet the demand, did institute their own lottery system a few years ago that shut out Clinton and Boylston, because back in the 1950s or whenever they created these districts, they were not member districts, because for generations, literally, you could always be guaranteed a slot at Aspet because they didn't have to go through they didn't meet all their quotas. But now they were, and so what that meant is that schools like Boylston and Clinton, who typically could send a few students in that were competitive to meet that admission process, now are completely shut out. So they've had to create agreements. I think Clinton just formed an agreement with Leicester Vocational School, and Boylston, I think, is in an agreement with the Leominster Vocational School. But that's not going to be sustainable, and it was heartbreaking to hear from parents that their grandfather, their father had all gone to a trade school and their child wanted to go and suddenly couldn't do that. So I think, we're not going to be able to build 1 million vocational schools tomorrow. So I think, like the senator kind of emphasized, looking at creative ways to create those opportunities to continue to support the incredible work our vocational schools do, and what's necessary. We talked about healthcare earlier. A lot of kids are going to healthcare programs and able to graduate and enter that workforce immediately. So I think it's a top of mind for many of us in the legislature.
Okay, we have time for one more.
One more.
One more question in the back.
Hi, I'm Leah Scoliotis. I'm the CEO of Crossroads Continuum. We're an autism nonprofit and also the board chair of the Family Health Center of Worcester, which is the second largest community health center in the Commonwealth. I appreciate you all talking about the fact that this is a system, that there are many pieces and parts that all play together. One of the things I wanted to ask about, as a baby boomer myself, what kinds of programs and services can you put in place to reskill a large population that could be a very important part of the workforce in many ways? So I'm just curious.
Well, one program that was put in place, which I know is very controversial here, actually, when I say here, I mean just in general Massachusetts, the free community colleges. That's an aspect that we have that we're trying to work, we're trying to have community colleges work more with the vocational schools and the public schools, and also chambers of commerce and different workforce development programs to try to identify different skills that are needed in these different areas that, whether it's seniors, and I'm part of the baby boom population, that, he may need to be reskilled so that we can fill the void. There was one article I read that the baby boomers, just because we are leaving the workforce, everyone says, oh, the younger generation doesn't want to work. One of the problems is we've got an economy and infrastructure built on one of the largest demographics, the baby boomers, and we're all entering the senior citizen status. And we are going to be putting a lot of financial pressure on the services that we expect that we provided other generations. So we need to try to find ways to have our demographics stay in the workforce and contribute.
Representative Donaghue, I'll give you the last word.
So I'm fairly certain I'm the oldest of the legislators here. I came into this career at age 68, and I hear one of the questions that we didn't get to was about workforce development, and I think one of the places where we can, an untapped resource is the older adults. A lot of people would be willing. I came out of retirement to do this. I didn't do this for the money. Everybody here knows that. I came out of retirement to do this, and I came out of retirement to do this because I wanted to contribute to society. I was at a meeting with the Framingham delegation about the issues at MetroWest Hospital, and they were saying, what can you do to help our workforce? And I pointed to the mayor. Both of us came out of retirement because we wanted to help our communities. And there are people who, if they structure things in a way that will accommodate our older adults. So I mentioned this to the CEO of MetroWest at this meeting. And a month later, I was having coffee with a constituent and a group of people, just ran into them in a coffee shop. And the person is saying, I'm so excited, I just went back to my old job. I only have to work 4 days a month. And now I'm working at the hospital. She said, I thought I was going to have to take a pay cut, but they're paying me the same hourly wage that I was paying. And so it's not an exact answer to your question. I was going to mention what the senator mentioned was the free community college. But I think that employers do need to look at creative ways of keeping people in the workforce. And if we give opportunities for older adults to contribute without it being you work full-time 5 days a week or you're not working. If we can make it more flexible to accommodate the needs of people with flexible needs, I think it's going to be a win-win for everybody. It helps keep Social Security more solvent when people are working longer. Towards the point that the senator made of baby boomers leaving the workforce, there's a huge amount of knowledge loss as the baby boomers are leaving the workforce. If we provide flexibility, so it's not an all or nothing thing, I think it helps society, it helps the employers, and it helps the individuals.
Thank you so much. Karen has some announcements. I've got 2 things to say. First of all, I commend you all for coming today, and I mean that in all sincerity. Your attendance here doesn't just help the chamber, it helps our entire community by participating. And it gets to my second point, which is the rules get made by those who show up. You have on your table all the contact information for everybody here. I can guarantee each of these people are glad to have a phone call. I'm glad to get them. And if you want to make a difference, you got to tell them what you think and why you think. If you sit and don't do anything and complain, stop. You have no right to do it. Finally, thank you to everybody here, my friends coming each year. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for everything you do. Thanks.